The Iliad Summary. Homer's epic of rage, glory, and war.
The Iliad is an ancient Greek epic poem attributed to Homer, likely composed around the 8th century BCE and set during the final stretch of the Trojan War. It is not the story of the Trojan Horse or the fall of Troy. It is a tightly focused drama about what happens when the greatest fighter on one side refuses to fight and everyone else pays the bill. At the centre is Achilles, the Greek coalition's best warrior, and a question that feels modern in any high-pressure group. When pride is wounded, who gets to absorb the consequences? The poem tracks how status, humiliation, and public reputation can turn a collective mission into a personal vendetta. The Iliad is also a war story that refuses to stay abstract. It shows leaders making decisions for honour and order, soldiers dying for those decisions, and families inside the walls watching the cost arrive. The story turns on whether Achilles can let go of rage long enough to rejoin the war without losing himself. Key points. The Iliad follows a short, explosive period late in the Trojan War, driven by a feud inside the Greek camp. Achilles' withdrawal from battle turns a military siege into a leadership crisis and a moral test. The poem treats honour as a real currency that can buy loyalty or trigger catastrophe when stolen. Gods intervene constantly, amplifying human emotions and turning small choices into large consequences. Hector emerges as Troy's stabilizing defender, balancing duty to the city with love for his family. The fighting escalates through retaliations, oaths broken under pressure, and pride that cannot back down. The Iliad's power comes from pairing battlefield spectacle with intimate scenes of grief, pleading, and shame. Full plot. Here is the full plot summary with spoilers. The poem opens in the Greek camp outside Troy, deep into a long war that has already consumed years. The Greeks are a coalition of kings and war leaders, nominally commanded by Agamemnon, commander of the Greek forces, determined to defend his authority. Achilles, the Greeks' greatest warrior, demanding public respect, leads the Myrmidons and has become essential to Greek success. Act 1. Set-up and inciting incident. A plague tears through the Greek camp because Agamemnon refuses to return Chryseis, a captive woman, claimed as a prize, to her father, Chryses, a priest of Apollo, desperate to recover his daughter. Achilles calls an assembly because the army is dying and morale is cracking. Calchas, a seer, trying to speak truth without being punished, explains that Apollo is punishing the Greeks for insulting Chryses. Agamemnon agrees to give Chryseis back, but he frames it as a loss that must be repaid. The demand is not just for compensation, but for dominance. Agamemnon orders that Briseis, Achilles' captive prize, a symbol of his status, be taken from Achilles instead. Achilles reads this as a public humiliation. If Agamemnon can seize Achilles' prize, Agamemnon can seize anything, and Achilles' honour becomes an empty word. Achilles nearly kills Agamemnon on the spot, and only stops when Athena, a goddess aligned with Greek success, restraining a disaster, intervenes. Achilles chooses a different weapon, withdrawal. Achilles announces that Achilles and the Myrmidons will not fight. It is a strike by the coalition's most irreplaceable specialist, and it is meant to expose the commander's dependence. Achilles then appeals to Thetis, Achilles' mother, a sea nymph with access to Olympus, to make the Greeks suffer until Agamemnon understands what was stolen. Thetis approaches Zeus, king of the gods, managing divine rivalries as much as human outcomes, and persuades Zeus to tilt the war toward Troy for a time. The decision turns Achilles' private grievance into a strategic curse on his own side. With Achilles absent, the war does not pause. Zeus sends Agamemnon a deceptive dream promising victory, and Agamemnon rallies the army to attack. Agamemnon's leadership is already unstable, and the dream becomes fuel for overconfidence. The Greeks assemble in full force, and the poem makes the coalition feel real. Many leaders, many rivalries, one fragile command structure. The armies meet, and the conflict tries to resolve itself through spectacle. Paris, a Trojan prince responsible for the war's origin and protecting his pride, offers single combat. Menelaus, Helen's husband, seeking to reclaim his marriage and status, answers. The duel appears to offer a clean ending. If Paris loses, Helen can be returned and the war can stop. Menelaus overpowers Paris, but Aphrodite, a goddess protecting Paris for her own reasons, rescues Paris from death. The promised clarity dissolves into divine interference. A truce forms anyway, sealed by oaths, but it cannot survive the forces that started the war: rivalry, resentment, and the need to win rather than merely settle. Athena manipulates Pandarus, a Trojan archer tempted by glory, into shooting Menelaus and breaking the truce. Menelaus survives, but the symbolic damage is done. The oath-breaking resets the war with added bitterness, because now the fighting can be framed as justified retaliation. Battle surges across the plain. Diomedes, a Greek champion chasing glory and momentum, has a day of ferocious success, even wounding gods who try to protect their favorites. The gods do not merely help, they personalize the war, turning the battlefield into an arena where cosmic grudges play out through human bodies. Inside Troy, Hector, Troy's leading defender trying to keep the city alive, carries the weight of the whole siege. Hector returns to the city to urge prayers and order, and he meets Andromache, Hector's wife, terrified of becoming a widow, and their infant son. Andromache begs Hector to fight smarter, to stay near the walls, to treat survival as a form of duty. Hector cannot accept a defensive version of honor. Hector tells Andromache that Hector must face the risk, because if Hector refuses, Troy loses everything anyway. Hector's tenderness does not change the logic that traps him. Hector also confronts Paris, whose reluctance and vanity insult the seriousness of the city's danger. Paris eventually returns to the battle, but the family's internal fractures mirror the coalition fractures outside. The war is not just Greeks versus Trojans, it is a contest of competing definitions of duty. As fighting continues, Hector and Ajax, a massive Greek warrior built for blunt endurance, duel without a clear winner, and the armies agree to pause long enough to collect and bury the dead. Both sides build and reinforce positions. The Greeks construct a defensive wall around their ships, proof that without Achilles, the Greeks no longer expect simple dominance. The conflict is hardening into a siege of attrition. What changes here is that Achilles' wounded pride becomes the war's central engine, and both armies begin paying interest on that decision. Act 2. Escalation and midpoint shift. Zeus now tightens the screws. The gods' interventions become less chaotic and more programmatic. Troy must advance, the Greeks must panic, and the absence of Achilles must become visible in blood. The Trojans push the Greeks back toward the ships, and the Greek wall becomes a desperate boundary rather than a symbol of control. Night falls with Trojan watchfires burning on the plain, close enough to make the Greek camp feel trapped. The Greeks hold councils under pressure, and leadership fractures sharpen. Agamemnon wavers and even suggests retreat, which exposes how brittle the coalition is when victory is no longer guaranteed. Diomedes rebukes the idea, not out of affection for Agamemnon, but because the shame of abandonment would destroy them. Nestor, an older Greek advisor trying to preserve the coalition, argues for the obvious fix: reconcile with Achilles. An embassy goes to Achilles, Odysseus, a strategist trying persuasion over force, Phoenix, Achilles' older mentor, appealing to family feeling, and Ajax, a blunt soldier, appealing to comradeship. Agamemnon offers gifts, apology, and the return of Briseis, treating reconciliation like a transaction. Achilles refuses. Achilles' refusal is not just stubbornness, it is an indictment of the entire system. Achilles argues that the brave and the coward die alike, that reward does not match risk, and that the leadership's honor language is a tool used to spend other men's lives. Achilles reveals the personal stakes beneath the politics. Achilles knows Achilles is fated for a short life if Achilles stays, and a long life if Achilles leaves. The offer of treasure cannot compete with the prospect of living. The embassy fails, and the consequences arrive quickly. Fighting resumes with intensified violence because there is no longer a diplomatic off-ramp. Many Greek leaders are wounded, pulling more strain onto fewer bodies. The Greeks begin operating in survival mode, improvising raids and counterattacks that feel like symptoms rather than strategy. The Trojans assault the Greek wall in force. The boundary around the ships is breached under sustained pressure, and the battle compresses into close quarters where panic spreads faster than orders. The gods push and pull, but the human logic remains consistent. Each side sees a narrow opening and tries to widen it before the other can respond. As the Trojans press toward the ships, the war becomes existential for the Greeks. If the ships burn, the coalition is stranded, and the entire expedition collapses into massacre or captivity. The Greek camp becomes a literal cliff edge. Watching the Greek losses, Patroclus, Achilles' closest companion, desperate to stop the slaughter, breaks down. Patroclus begs Achilles to relent, or at least to let Patroclus enter battle wearing Achilles' armor so the Trojans will think Achilles has returned. Achilles agrees, but with strict conditions. Patroclus must drive the Trojans away from the ships and then return, not chase glory toward Troy's walls. Achilles is trying to control the war without surrendering the moral point of the strike. Patroclus enters the battle with the Myrmidons, and the plan works at first. The Trojans recoil, shaken by the apparent return of Achilles. Patroclus fights with a mixture of borrowed authority and real skill, and the Greeks surge back from collapse. The crisis appears to be turning, then the borrowed identity becomes a trap. Patroclus, intoxicated by momentum and the desire to finish what Achilles began, pushes beyond Achilles' limit. Patroclus drives toward Troy, and the gods intervene decisively. Apollo, a god favoring Troy at this moment, enforcing the boundary of fate, strikes Patroclus, breaking Patroclus' strength and stripping away the symbolic protection of Achilles' armor. Euphorbus, a Trojan warrior, seizing a fleeting advantage, wounds Patroclus, and Hector arrives to deliver the final blow. Hector kills Patroclus and takes Achilles' armor as a trophy. The death detonates the story's moral geometry. Achilles' attempt to punish Agamemnon has now destroyed the person Achilles loves most, and the strike that was meant to reveal dependence has instead revealed vulnerability. The Greeks fight desperately to recover Patroclus' body. The battle becomes a tug-of-war over a corpse, because bodies matter as symbols. To recover the dead is to preserve honor. To lose them is to be shamed again. When Achilles hears the news, the rage changes temperature. It is no longer political. It becomes grief weaponized. Thetis returns to Achilles, and Achilles makes the next decision with full awareness of its cost. Achilles will kill Hector, even if it means Achilles' own death will follow soon after. The poem presents this choice as a hard acceptance rather than a heroic impulse. Achilles is stepping into fate with open eyes because life without Patroclus feels like a lesser death. Hephaestus, a goldsmith repaying Thetis' plea, forges new armor for Achilles, including the famous shield that holds scenes of the world. Cities at peace and war, labor, harvest, dancing, judgment, and ordinary life. The shield is not decoration. It is the poem widening the lens, reminding the listener that the war consumes a world that contains far more than war. What changes here is that the conflict stops being about status and starts being about vengeance, with Achilles choosing a path that will not let Achilles return to the person Achilles was. Act 3. Climax and Resolution. Achilles returns to the Greek assembly and confronts Agamemnon. Agamemnon offers formal repair, gifts, Briseis, and words meant to re-stitch authority. Achilles accepts the functional outcome but rejects the frame. Achilles is not fighting for Agamemnon anymore. Achilles is fighting for Patroclus, and the war's cause shrinks into a personal mission. Achilles arms for battle in the new divine armor and enters the field like a natural disaster. The poem's violence escalates in intensity and scale. Achilles slaughters Trojans in waves, and the language emphasizes excess. Bodies pile up, rivers clog, and the line between valor and cruelty blurs. At one point, Achilles battles the river itself when the river god rises in anger at the choking corpses. The gods fight openly now, not as whispers behind choices, but as visible forces that shove mortals into collision. The Trojans retreat toward the city walls. Apollo tricks Achilles away from a direct breach, buying time for Trojans to scramble inside. Only Hector remains outside the gates. Hector hesitates, trapped between two unbearable outcomes: run and live with shame, or stand and likely die. Hector chooses to face Achilles, but fear breaks the choice into motion, and Hector flees. Achilles chases Hector around the walls of Troy, turning the duel into a public orbit of terror and inevitability. Athena intervenes by deceiving Hector into stopping. Hector turns and fights. Achilles kills Hector in single combat, driving the spear through Hector's vulnerable point. Hector, dying, warns Achilles about Achilles' own fate and asks for the dignity of burial. Achilles refuses mercy. Achilles' grief has hardened into an ethic of desecration. If Patroclus received no kindness, Hector will receive none. Achilles drags Hector's body behind Achilles' chariot in front of Troy's walls, letting Hector's family watch the humiliation. Priam, king of Troy, losing the center of his city, and Hecuba, Hector's mother, drowning in grief, mourn from the ramparts. Andromache collapses when she learns Hector is dead, and the poem lingers on the domestic ruin, now guaranteed for her and her child. Back at the Greek camp, Patroclus's ghost appears to Achilles in a dream, demanding burial rites so Patroclus can pass into the underworld. Achilles stages Patroclus's funeral with lavish ceremony and brutal vengeance, including sacrifices and acts meant to honor the dead through the suffering of the living. The Greeks hold funeral games, distributing prizes as if the world can still run on rules. The rituals create a temporary order, but Achilles remains trapped in rage. For days, Achilles continues to abuse Hector's corpse, dragging it again and again, unable to convert grief into anything but repetition. The gods themselves recoil at the imbalance. Apollo argues that Hector deserves respect, and Zeus decides the desecration must end. The divine decision is not purely moral, it is political, an attempt to restore a boundary between enemies that war has erased. Zeus sends Thetis to instruct Achilles to release Hector's body, and sends Iris to guide Priam toward an unthinkable act. Priam must go personally into the Greek camp to beg Achilles for Hector's corpse. Priam prepares a ransom and travels under Hermes' protection. The journey is a descent into enemy territory powered by love and desperation. Priam enters Achilles' tent at night and performs the most dangerous form of humility. Priam kneels before the man who killed Priam's son. Priam does not argue strategy or justice. Priam asks Achilles to remember Achilles' own father, Peleus, and to imagine an old man waiting for a son who will never return. The appeal pierces the armor. Achilles weeps with Priam, and for the first time since Patroclus' death, Achilles' emotions widen rather than narrow. Grief becomes shared rather than weaponized. Achilles agrees to release Hector's body and orders it washed and prepared so Priam does not have to stare at the damage. Achilles and Priam eat together, a fragile ritual of human normality in the middle of slaughter. Achilles grants Troy a truce so Hector can be mourned and buried properly. Priam returns to Troy with Hector's body, and the Trojans hold funeral rites. The poem ends on Hector's burial, not on Greek victory, because the emotional resolution is not conquest. It is the restoration of a minimal human dignity across enemy lines. Analysis and themes. Theme 1. Rage as a contagion. Claim, rage in the Iliad behaves like a force that spreads, escalates, and outlives its original cause. Evidence, Achilles' anger at Agamemnon begins as a dispute over status, but Zeus amplifies it into battlefield disaster. Patroclus' death turns rage into a killing spree, and Hector's death does not end it, because Achilles keeps reenacting the injury by abusing the corpse. The rage finally loosens, only when Priam's grief makes Achilles' loss feel shared rather than singular. So what? The poem treats anger as a social event, not a private feeling. When leaders refuse repair, anger becomes policy, and everyone around it becomes either a tool or a casualty. The Iliad shows how rage can become an identity that is hard to surrender because it feels like the only proof that the injury mattered. Theme 2. Honor as a real economy. Claim, honor in the Iliad is currency, and stealing it can collapse cooperation faster than any battlefield defeat. Evidence, Agamemnon's seizure of Briseis is not about desire. It is a public assertion that Achilles is subordinate. Achilles' withdrawal is a refusal to accept that valuation, even at catastrophic cost to Greek soldiers. The embassy's gifts fail because they treat honor like money, while Achilles treats honor like sovereignty. So what? Groups often pretend they run on mission and values, but actually run on status and recognition. The Iliad exposes how quickly teamwork dissolves when respect becomes arbitrary, when rewards do not match risk, and when leaders mistake authority for legitimacy. Theme 3. Fate and the limits of control. Claim, the Iliad argues that humans make choices, but those choices operate inside boundaries that cannot be negotiated away. Evidence, Achilles knows the bargain: stay and win glory with a short life, or leave and live long without fame. Patroclus tries to borrow Achilles' identity and cannot control the consequences once the gods intervene. Hector tries to choose the right kind of courage and still cannot escape the logic of the war pressing toward his death. So what? The poem is not fatalistic in the lazy sense. It shows that agency matters most at the level of meaning. You cannot always choose outcomes, but you can choose what you will become while moving toward them. Theme 4. War as a system that eats meaning. Claim, war in the Iliad turns human values into fuel, using love, loyalty, and pride to keep killing going. Evidence, oaths are broken, truces become tactical pauses, and corpses become bargaining chips. The fight over Patroclus' body shows how even grief becomes a contest. The shield of Achilles places ordinary life beside battle, emphasizing what war interrupts and consumes. So what? The Iliad refuses to let war stay romantic. It shows how violence reorganizes reality. It narrows choices, rewards cruelty, and makes decency feel like weakness unless it is backed by power. Theme 5. Leadership without self-mastery. Claim, the Iliad presents leadership failure as an inability to govern the self before governing others. Evidence, Agamemnon's pride starts the crisis, and his authority shrinks as the costs mount. Achilles' refusal to bend turns a personal injury into mass death. Hector's sense of duty contains real courage. But Hector's inability to accept strategic retreat helps push Troy toward disaster. So what? The poem suggests that leaders who cannot tolerate humiliation will make everyone else pay to repair their ego. It also suggests that virtue without flexibility can be fatal, because rigid honor creates predictable patterns the enemy can exploit. Theme 6: Grief as the door back to humanity. Claim: the Iliad's deepest movement is from rage toward empathy through shared grief. Evidence: Achilles' grief after Patroclus' death initially produces excess violence, not healing. Priam's night visit forces Achilles to see grief reflected in an enemy, and the shared weeping breaks the spell of dehumanization. The final truce and funeral rites are the poem's answer to what war tries to erase. The dead are still people. So what? The Iliad suggests that compassion is not a soft alternative to strength. It is a form of reality testing. It is the moment you remember the enemy has a father, a child, a body, and a future that can be broken. Character arcs. Protagonist: Achilles begins with a belief that honor must be protected at any cost, because without honor, life is worthless inside the warrior system. Achilles ends with a belief that even in war there is a boundary that must be restored, because without that boundary honor becomes indistinguishable from cruelty. The shift is forced by Patroclus' death, Achilles' own excess, and Priam's appeal to Achilles' capacity to feel grief as something shared rather than owned. Hector's arc matters because it sharpens the tragedy. Hector begins as Troy's stabilizer, trying to hold the city's defense together while maintaining an image of courage. Hector ends as the embodiment of a duty that cannot be fulfilled, trapped between private love and public expectation. Hector's choices do not feel foolish, they feel inevitable inside Hector's world. Priam's late arc delivers the poem's final moral turn. Priam begins as a distant king watching ruin accumulate, and becomes a father willing to risk everything to restore dignity to the dead, even if it means kneeling before the killer. Structure. The Iliad begins in the middle of a war and treats backstory as pressure rather than exposition. This makes the poem feel immediate. The war is already a machine, and the story is about what happens when a key gear jams. The narrative alternates between councils, duels, mass battle, and intimate domestic scenes. That rhythm keeps the poem from becoming either pure spectacle or pure lecture. Each shift in scale forces a shift in moral perspective. Strategy feels different when you see a child reaching for a helmet or an old man begging for a corpse. The gods function like a second layer of causality. They do not erase human choice, but they intensify it, turning pride into disaster and mercy into a political event. The shield of Achilles is the poem's structural masterstroke. It places an entire human world inside a war story, so every death carries implied subtraction. What most summaries miss. Many summaries treat the Iliad as a simple chain of events leading to a famous duel. The deeper structure is a study of how a social order teaches men to treat recognition as life itself. Achilles is not just angry. Achilles is enforcing the logic that keeps the warrior system coherent. If a leader can take your prize publicly, you are no longer a person in that system, you are a tool. Another overlooked element is how the poem links desecration to psychological stuckness. Achilles does not drag Hector's body because it is tactically useful. Achilles drags the body because Achilles cannot make meaning out of loss. The repetition is grief with nowhere to go. The gods intervene not only to protect Hector's corpse, but to stop Achilles from dissolving completely into the role of destroyer. Finally, the ending is not a soft reconciliation. It is a negotiated pause produced by exhaustion, ritual, and a sudden recognition that grief has the same shape on both sides. The poem does not claim war ends when someone becomes good. It claims war becomes unbearable when someone remembers the enemy is human and acts on that memory. Relevance today. The Iliad still maps cleanly onto modern life because it understands conflict as a mix of incentives, ego, and narrative. First, it is a brutal case study in workplace power and status. Agamemnon's mistake is not just being rude, it is confiscating a top performer's visible proof of value. In modern terms, it is taking credit, denying recognition, or publicly humiliating a key contributor, then acting surprised when the contributor stops contributing. Second, the poem predicts outrage dynamics. Achilles' rage grows because it is witnessed, debated, and reinforced. The public arena matters as much as the private wound. Modern media turns disputes into spectacles the same way the Greek assembly does. Once an insult becomes public, backing down looks like defeat. Third, the Iliad captures how institutions rationalize harm. Leaders frame decisions as necessary, and the cost lands on people with less power. The poem keeps showing bodies, names, and families to prevent the listener from hiding behind abstractions. Fourth, it is a book about escalation logic. The truce breaks, retaliation follows, and every side feels justified because the last wrong is always fresh. That pattern mirrors geopolitical spirals, where face-saving becomes a priority and off-ramps collapse. Fifth, it speaks to modern war's moral injury. The poem shows fighters who cannot return to normal feeling after loss and who channel grief into violence because it is the only sanctioned language available. The shift from grief to cruelty is presented as understandable and still disastrous. Sixth, it highlights how technology and distance can change accountability without changing consequence. In the Iliad, killing is close range and personal, which makes dehumanization harder to sustain. Modern war often adds distance, which can make desecration less visible but not less real. The Iliad's insistence on bodies and rights becomes a critique of any system that hides its dead. Seventh, the Priam Achilles scene offers a model for conflict repair that does not require agreement on blame. Priam does not persuade Achilles with policy. Priam persuades Achilles by forcing Achilles to see a shared human vulnerability. Modern reconciliation efforts often fail when they aim only at facts and ignore the emotional infrastructure of humiliation and grief. Ending explained. The Iliad ends with Hector's body returned to Troy and buried under a truce, not with Troy's fall or Greek victory. The ending means that the poem's real resolution is not military, but moral. Achilles' rage finally hits a limit when it meets a father's grief face to face. The ending resolves the story's central movement from wounded pride to total vengeance to a fragile restoration of dignity. Achilles does not become gentle, and the war does not stop. But Achilles re-enters the human world where enemies still deserve burial and mourning. What the ending refuses to resolve is the larger conflict. The siege continues beyond the poem, and the larger Trojan War story belongs to other traditions. The Iliad stops at the moment when the cost of war becomes undeniable in a single room. An old king kneeling, a young killer weeping, and both recognizing that victory cannot undo death. Why it endures. The Iliad endures because it tells the truth about how conflict really works. It grows from pride, spreads through institutions, and feeds on stories people tell about what they deserve. The poem offers no clean heroes. It offers humans trapped inside a system that rewards violent excellence and punishes vulnerability. This is a work for readers who want war depicted as both thrilling and devastating, and who can tolerate moral ambiguity without being handed a lesson. It may not satisfy readers looking for a neat plot with a tidy ending, because the poem's power lies in how it stops before completion and forces you to sit with grief instead. The Iliad's final note is not triumph, but the uneasy question of what it costs to keep fighting when you no longer remember what you were fighting for. More insight, less noise. Subscribe and explore the full range at taylortailored.co.uk.